On the 12th of May 1911, the Crystal Palace held its largest single event, showcasing the best and brightest of its wealthy empire, and was designed to exploit the very latest technology, including a new electric tramway. It was said to proclaim the excellence of the United Kingdom, especially during a coronation year. One thing that seemed to not progress was the conditions of the working class, especially those in the seafaring industry. Sailors and dockyard hands knew that working on and near the sea had its dangers. It was felt that despite the very latest in technology and innovation at the time, not enough was being done to secure their safety. In addition, their pay was some of the lowest and the working conditions could only be described as deplorable. As the job was perceived as low-skilled, many men that aired grievances and dared to complain were usually forced out of their role in favour of men that wanted to work. By 1911, wages for these workers were not keeping up with the cost of living increases, and the impact was felt most in the town of Southampton and Liverpool. Both were large port towns, and the local trade unions were less than impressed with the workers' conditions. In 1910, the president of the National Sailors and Firemen's Union pressed an ultimatum including a scaled increase in wages and the end of compulsory medical examinations before the men were even allowed to work. After much negotiations, nothing was working and neither the union or the Shipping Federation, the body in charge of the ports, could reach any form of resolution. The unions, fed up with the lack of progress, decided to call a national strike on June the 14th. However, Southampton kicked it all off early. In the harbour, waiting for another trip to New York, sat the White Star Line's premier liner, Olympic. While the upper decks were the most luxurious you could imagine, in the boiler rooms, conditions were the total opposite. Men would work for hours feeding the massive boilers in stifling heat. It also didn't help that the crew had gotten wind that the White Star Line's rival company, Cunard, were paying their workers more money for similar work. To add to the Olympics' woes, not only were the deckhands unhappy, but so were the coal porters, who were refusing to refuel the ship until their own pay demands had also been met. The White Star Line, desperate not to delay the Olympics crossing, agreed to both the coal porters and the crew's demands, and the strike on the Olympic ended 48 hours after it began. But the union wasn't satisfied and, spurred on by the Olympic success, pushed forward with the national strike. The strikes were the start of a wave of strikes throughout the summer and led to the closure of several major ports, and at one point over 250,000 people were on the picket line. It wasn't long before the wave of discontent hit the railway world. The most dangerous job on the line next to the shunters was the track's maintenance teams called platelayers. The majority of accidents with the workers laid in that sector. They were also the worst paid, and if any of them dared to complain, like the sailors, there were others in the wings ready to take over the work. With the increase in the cost of food, it pushed more and more workers onto the poverty line. When news reached them of the general strike from the dockyards, the railway workers came under pressure to stop work for any railway or company that was against the trade unions, and once again, empowered by the success, demanded better working conditions, better pay, and an end to the long 70-hour work weeks. The four major railway unions collaborated with each other and sat with the railway bosses and the government to try to cut a deal. But after several tense talks, it all broke down, and the first ever national strike took place at 4:30 that afternoon. For the first time ever, both rail and dockyard were shut down, and with a country with nothing more than a few motor cars and horse and carts, the country almost stopped overnight. Hundreds of thousands of railway workers took to the streets to protest their working conditions. Stations which were once bustling shut down. Goods were barely moving, and in some cases, people were left stranded. There were a few exceptions, and a few trains did run, but they were few and far between. To protect them, the government sent troops and stationed them at signal boxes crossings and areas where any perceived interference would grind the train to a halt. The city of Liverpool followed on from Southampton with its own dockyard strike. However, when the strikes in Southampton dockyard was called off, Liverpool kept going. 1 in 4 workers took to the streets, both eager to have their voices heard and hoping for the same success in Southampton. On the 13th of August, 80,000 striking workers descended on St George's Square in a peaceful rally. The rally had been carefully planned well in advance, but the police, fearing a riot, had sprung a trap, and as the rally escalated, 100 officers, most wielding truncheons, forced themselves out of their hiding place from the hall and charged at the people. Over 200 people ended up injured in hospital and 96 were arrested. The news of the arrest caused public outrage, and the peaceful rallies quickly gave way to all-out riots. And for 2 days, the streets were littered with them. In response, the Home Secretary, a very well-known man named Winston Churchill, ordered a military guard to try to keep the peace. Soldiers were deployed into the city. On Tuesday, the arrested men were moved in large prison vans surrounded by a mounted armed guard. Their location was Walton Jail, but as soon as they set off, they were surrounded by protesters who pelted them with stones, bricks and bottles. The police opened fire, and in the midst of the panic, 5 people were shot, with 2 passing away from their wounds. The crowds ran off, but they still closed ranks more than ever when it came to the strike action. The government, unable to move any more troops thanks to the stoppages from the rail workers, were forced to concede and negotiate new terms, and the dockyard strike was soon called off. The strikes were soon done in Liverpool, but in Lenani, another story was unfolding. The town had many different businesses and industries, but the most famous was tin. It was a thriving town. However, like others, poverty was not far behind. Families had to share rooms in cramped terraces, sometimes sleeping in basements that were full of damp and mould. The only source of water into homes was a communal tap, and the majority of the homes had no sanitation. Lenani had some of the highest infant mortality rates in the country, and what was worse was that the gap between the rich and poor was more noticeable here than anywhere else. The gas workers, tin workers and railway workers were the poorest of the poor, with many finding themselves unable to pay for basic food for their families. Many people simply starved. The news of the National Railway strike hit the town, and for workers the atmosphere was joyous. People celebrated with parties and singing and dancing, but later that night troops arrived to take control of the railway, and they failed, and the Riot Act was consequently read. The troops regrouped and the crowds gathered, but the mood soon turned sour, and stones were thrown at moving trains to the chant of "Black Boot," a common term for striking workers that were working. The mood didn't improve, and on the 19th it came to a head. A train was reaching the crossing gates. The signalman closed the gates and laid on the tracks in front of the train, stopping it. This allowed men to storm the train and dump the fire. The soldiers quickly surrounded the train as the crowds fled up the banking. The soldiers were ordered to fire on the fleeing crowd, and the commander saw several men sitting on a wall. He pointed at the men and commanded to shoot them. Some refused, but some didn't, and 2 would die as a result. As the news broke of the men's deaths, the crowds marched on the station. Windows were smashed, points destroyed, and the track tore up. The goods shed was looted, and the person suspected of organising the troops to come, Magistrate Thomas Jones, was vilified, and a warehouse, who he owned, was destroyed, with both the police and soldiers powerless to stop him. Later that night, several railway trucks were set alight, including one containing carbide. The carbide exploded, killing 4 more people. It took 300 specialist troops from other areas to converge to restore order within the town. The riots were some of the worst in the country, leaving 7 dead, scores injured, and thousands of pounds in damage. Around the same time as the explosions, the strike had been called off after the unions and the government had reached a resolution. But it was too little too late. The local press were not keen to report on the story, citing the reputation of the town was in tatters. But the national press showed pictures from the riots and defended the actions of the troops as justified. The 2 men that were shot were buried, but on their inquest a verdict of justifiable homicide was given. This caused more upset. The two men that were shot were buried, but on their inquest, a verdict of justifiable homicide was given. This caused more upset, and a 1,000-strong march was organised later that month. The town wanted an inquiry and had support from the press, but it was vetoed. It was the first ever national railway strike, and the very last time a British soldier had fired on its own civilians on British soil. The government was heavily criticised in being too heavy-handed, with some saying that the riots wouldn't even have started if the soldiers had not been called. The press were quick to publish pictures of the riots from the Lanny, and in response, the town really spoke of it. Today, very few in the town know the story, and the local papers publish very little to help the people move on. In a direct response to the strike, 3 of the rail unions got together to form the National Union of Railwaymen. The union was open to anyone who worked the rails, regardless of status. They helped shape many changes over the years, including preventing wage reductions, and at one point had nearly 500,000 members. The union would eventually merge with the National Union of Seamen, and a new union called the RMT was born, and it still exists today.